Hi and welcome. I'm really delighted to see you tonight for the second in our series, The Housing System. I'm Rosalie Ginevra, the Executive Director of the League. And tonight's program takes a look from multiple points of view at an approach to meeting the demand for housing that's become very hot in the last couple of years. The idea that building smaller units, whether micro units or studios or tiny houses, can make a substantial dent in our housing shortage and supply a kind of dwelling that will more closely meet what a large segment of the population seems to be looking for in housing. The overall housing system series, our six-part series, is organized around some cross-cutting questions, like tonight's critical examination of the issue of small units, in the hope that the presentations and discussions will generate some new perspectives on the nature and interrelationships of different elements of the overall housing system. As I said last week, the series it's not organized to be about affordable housing or about homelessness or about public housing or about the luxury market or middle-class homeowners, nor is it about specific design strategies or financing models or policy innovations, but rather it's meant to touch on all of those things. And it's called The Housing System to emphasize the point of view that all aspects of the ways that we finance, design, develop, maintain, and inhabit housing for all income levels are interconnected, dynamic, and mutually affecting. The series is focused on the material reality of housing because, of course, this is the Architectural League, but also because we think that the material reality of the housing that we create so directly reflects the values that drive the housing system and the value that we assign to our housing. Before I introduce tonight's presenters, I just want to say that I hope you'll come to upcoming programs in the series. Next week's program is called What's Mine is Yours, and it's about shared housing and co-living, which is, of course, inextricably connected to tonight's discussion about small units. And I hope you'll come to the rest of the series as well on May 23rd about innovative approaches to zoning that are allowing the introduction of different housing typologies into formerly single-family neighborhoods in Los Angeles and Minneapolis, and what lessons those approaches might offer in New York. And on May 30th on new technologies and new materials, and on Monday, June 10th, which will start at 4 p.m. I know a hard time to come for a program at, but we did that to accommodate one of our speakers who we really wanted to have, for a conversation about learning about systemic change from another complicated social construct, the healthcare system. Tonight's program is about small. The structure of the program is that we will have 3 presentations, and then the presenters will be joined on stage by 3 architect interlocutors for a discussion. Our first presenter is Jonah Coe-Scharff, an architectural historian and current Masters of Architecture student at Princeton. Jonah will provide context for our discussion with an analysis of the evolution of the idea of the minimal dwelling, with particular reference to New York City. Following Jonah, we'll hear from Jessica Yager, who recently became the Vice President for Policy and Planning at Women in Need, which is a major provider of housing and programs for women and children in New York. Previously, she was Executive Director of the Furman Center, New York's most prolific and effective think tank for policy research on housing. And she's going to talk tonight about research conducted at Furman on measuring whether small units actually deliver what they promise, and that is less expensive, more efficient housing for individuals who want to live alone. And the research also looked at how city policy and regulations shape what kinds of and how many small units can be built. Our third presenter is Susan Saegert, an environmental and social psychologist at the CUNY Graduate Center, who will discuss some of the potential psychological impacts of small and crowded spaces. More extensive biographical information on each of the speakers is available in the printed program. Following the presentations, the architects Andrew Bernheimer, Miriam Peterson, and Bill Stein will join Jonah, Jessica, and Susan on stage for a discussion. Andy, Miriam, and Bill have all designed small dwellings, and our goal with the discussion is to tease out the implications for design of the history, findings, and positions put forward in the presentations. There are all kinds of issues, from cultural trends to demographics to resource use to daily experience to cost, and we hope to delve into many of them tonight. So please join me in welcoming first Jonah Coe-Scharff for his presentation.
Thank you so much, Rosalie, and thank you, Rosalie and Emily, for having organized this and invited me. It's a real honor to be here and an honor to be sharing the stage with such distinguished speakers. In 1857, a special commission of the New York State Legislature summed up the housing situation in New York City as follows. The landlord measures the rooms and estimates not their capacities for accommodating human life in health and comfort, but their capability of containing human life to pay the rent. The comment foreshadows a problem that would become one of the central preoccupations of housing reformers in the first half of the 20th century. How was one to measure a dwelling's capacities for accommodating human life in health and comfort? If unfettered capitalism was producing quote-unquote substandard dwellings, then what was the standard for the minimally acceptable or desirable dwelling? In other words, in the first half of the 20th century, architects and housing experts participated in a conversation that belonged to an entirely different paradigm than today's conversation about small dwellings. Rather than minimizing the dwelling to reduce costs, they sought to establish a quote-unquote irreducible minimum, more generous than the housing commonly available on the market, but precisely calibrated to the needs of healthy human life. Rosalie has asked us tonight to step back and rethink some of the assumptions that are shaping the current conversation about affordable housing in New York. And as will become clear, I don't think we should simply revive this lost paradigm of the minimum dwelling. In fact, as I'll argue, there are a number of ways in which the concept of the minimum dwelling proved to be extraordinarily problematic. But I do think that re-examining this history offers a useful opportunity for examining some of our basic assumptions. So what I want to do is to share 3 historical episodes, as it were adventures in the history of the concept of the minimum dwelling, and try to draw from each a lesson in the form of a question. And then at the end, I'll come back to the micro-apartment and the small dwelling today, and try to draw out more explicitly what reading it against this history of the minimum dwelling might have to offer. Historians have broadly noted a shift in American housing reform discourse from a focus on restrictive legislation in the late 19th century through 1910s to a focus on constructive legislation in the mid-1930s. In that earlier moment, vague concepts of the minimum dwelling offered a language for setting the bounds of the unacceptable. New laws established that no occupant should be crowded into less than 400 cubic feet. No room less than 70 square feet could be used for sleeping. Such numbers were not so much guarantees as they were quantitative tools to guide the policing of tenement districts, where sanitary police could knock on your door in the middle of the night to expel illegal lodgers. But by 1919, reformers like Edith Elmer Wood began to notice a brewing economic contradiction, where stricter housing regulations had increased rents for new construction without increasing the supply of housing affordable to the lower 2/3 of wage earners. 5 years later, the architect Clarence Stein warned of an ominous parting of the ways between the adequate house and the inadequate incomes of those who cannot dwell in the house. Underlying such arguments was a concept of a minimum, this adequate house, that was out of reach. The leading housing activist Catherine Bauer made the theme of the minimum dwelling explicit in her landmark book, Modern Housing of 1934. Bauer had visited the new modernist housing estates developed in Weimar Germany, and especially in Frankfurt, and she had been taken with the German discourse on housing for das Existenzminimum, that is, the minimum subsistence level. Housing was theorized as a kind of ration, akin to rationed food. And when Bauer and her associate Louis Mumford presented a number of these projects at MoMA in 1932, Mumford would take up the existence minimum idea by calling the modern house a biological institution, where architecture was the direct outcome of primary physiological requirements. In Bauer's hands, the idea of a biological minimum was knit together with a politics resembling British Fabian socialists' idea of a national minimum wage. The minimum dwelling was to be a political demand. It offered the possibility of insisting on the right of every person, of every body, with its homogeneous physiological needs, the same minimum architectural standards. These would extend beyond bare subsistence to include what Mumford had called the vital wants of culture and civic life. And so Bauer's enumeration of minimum standards included playgrounds, schools, nearby access to shops, community facilities, and employment. The idea was that the physiological and sociological basis of these minima made them impervious to downward revision. Bauer explained, they do not in any sense constitute a sliding scale, an ideal which must be modified in practice. The whole point of view behind such minimum standards precludes the possibility of modifying them in deference to class or income distinctions. This, then, was the minimum dwelling's basic promise and paradox. As a rhetorical apparatus, it could circumvent the pragmatics of economy with the moral clarity of need. Here was the minimum dwelling, here were the inadequate incomes. The only path forward was to break out of the private housing market with public subsidies. Bauer would spend the next several years of her life advocating successfully for the creation of a federal public housing program in 1937. And yet this political purchase came at a price. Bauer's insistence on the absolute scientific, homogeneous irreducibility of her minimum standards suppressed the fraught politics of measuring human need. What did it mean politically or architecturally to claim something as an irreducible minimum? And so the first lesson that I want to sort of take away from the history is this: the minimum dwelling can be a political rhetoric for positing the necessary against the possible. But what other politics does it suppress? The next two episodes I want to share begin to pick apart this problem. The first deals with the issue of measurement and its relationship to the activity of imagination. That is, how would one quantify and demarcate the spatial or architectural needs of the prospective inhabitant? Initially, tenement house laws and building codes incorporated standards for minimum cubic feet per occupant, based on health experts' calculations of air exchange rates needed for healthful respiration. But as we know, there's more to space than sort of pure homogeneous cubic footage. Reformers and architects began to recognize that space was not a generic quantum, that minimum needs might also depend on the specificities of a dwelling subdivision and organization. One influential federal report from the early 1930s offered the following common sense criteria for the minimum dimensions of the kitchen. Quote, "It must be large enough so that daughters may be taught cooking, and should not be so small that children will be bumped, turned, or trampled, or that a woman is baked when the roast is done, and stewed when the soup is finished." Fair enough, but of course this basic enunciation of functional need already held a particular and ideologically charged imagination of the kitchen, the way the kitchen will be used. Not only is the kitchen a gendered space, it's a space of domestic pedagogy, a space designed for a specific kind of household in which the same person is responsible both for cooking and for child rearing. Imagining the life within the dwelling was no mere technique for estimating spatial and functional needs. The very act of imagination began to become normative. This normative imagination would continue to haunt the efforts to establish minimum spatial needs of dwellings over the following decades. In 1937, the American Public Health Association set up the Committee for the Hygiene of Housing. They immediately set about trying to establish quantifiable criteria for the health of the dwelling, conducting experiments on optimal environmental temperature in order to extrapolate standards for heating and cooling equipment. That was easy to do in a laboratory. But when it came to measuring the spatial needs of the household, the language of public health provided a scientific veneer to what was, again, ultimately, prejudicial common sense. The APHA's Subcommittee on Occupancy Standards declared that architects should visualize as fully as they can the varied uses of family life which their buildings will be put. Spatial standards would then be derived by adding up the areas for all the different activities that had to happen side by side. The procedure had been borrowed from a German emigre sociologist named Sven Riemer, who had emphasized that space planning was a matter of resolving so-called conflicts in space and time. And what you can see here is his diagram of a family that he had studied in one of his influential studies in Stockholm, where he mapped where each member of the household was supposed to be at any given time of the day, and then you could sort of figure out when they were supposed to be in the same place and add up all the areas and figure out how big the dwelling had to be. Riemer's paradigmatic example of such a conflict in space and time again took the gendered division of labor as given. He described the friction in the leisure time hours of the evening between the housewife's dishwashing and the husband's relaxation, radio listening, and so forth. Indeed, Reamer had argued more broadly that the purpose of studying the way occupants use domestic space was not simply to design to its current use, but to determine whether an observed behavior was, quote, an undesirable consequence of overcrowding, or, quote, a pattern of behavior with a validity of its own, end quote. Redesign slipped into re-education. Health was not an a priori given, but a category constructed as a site for the application of expert knowledge to articulate, distinguish, and prescribe acceptable and unacceptable patterns of life. And imagination, that seemingly innocent activity, could serve to prescribe rather than describe if used uncritically. And so this is the second lesson that I want to try to draw. Designing the minimum dwelling might require imagining its inhabitants' way of life, but whose way of life are we imagining, and to what end? Beyond the problem of measurement, there is what we might call the problem of luxuries and necessities. If the promise of the minimum dwelling was to offer a basic standard, a threshold of the acceptable, then that meant paring away luxuries until you were left with the bare minimum essentials. Yet here, too, this seemingly simple operation of proposing a minimum standard quickly became ensnared in the fraught politics of legislating need on behalf of others. A useful case study here is the activities of the New York City Housing Authority under the leadership of Alfred Reinstein between 1937 and 1939. This was a moment when, for a variety of reasons, NYCHA faced extreme internal and external pressure to decrease per unit costs. At the same time, Reinstein imagined that experiments in cost reduction in the public sector could set precedents for lower cost housing developed by the private sector. Public housing had the freedom, he argued, to, quote, more truly reflect the real needs and appropriate standards. The first of the two projects designed under Reinstein's tenure as commissioner was Brooklyn's Red Hook Houses, which remains the city's largest public housing project. Consisting of 6-story cruciform towers arranged around a grand avenue, it has long been dismissed by architectural historians as banal, significant only for its prefiguration of greater banality yet to come. But it was precisely in the most banal choices that the authority was forced to elaborate a concept of the minimum dwelling. Controversially, NYCHA decided to substitute curtain tracks for closet doors, saving $120,000 across the project, real money in 1939, particularly because tenants were going to provide the curtains at their own expense. But the State Housing Board protested. In their view, the lack of closet doors would have, quote, a lower influence on family life and discipline, end quote. NYCHA testily wrote back that, quote, when clothes are visible, then the articles in space are more easily kept in neat condition, end quote. Paring away luxuries to arrive at the threshold of bare necessity proved again to be a haphazard project of social engineering in which prospective residents' ways of life were abstracted to half-thought arguments in an exchange of bureaucratic paper. In another controversial move, the authority chose not to include shower heads in the Red Hook bathrooms. You can see here the bathroom on the left and the bedroom with the curtain rather than the closet door. As early as 1943, a tenant was complaining, just as you people have regarded a refrigerator, an incinerator, and a separate bathroom as necessary to the American home, I am sure that you would agree with me that at present, showers are just as necessary, even though we are former slum dwellers. Symbolically, the denial of the shower seemed tantamount to the denial of the American standard of living. But the authority stood behind its choice. Its experts had found that an increase in rents was unjustifiable for an item that, quote, cannot be called a necessity. Still, for every item the authority had deemed a luxury, there was another that had made the cut of necessity. Kitchens were axiomatically placed in the apartments adjacent to the apartment's entrance, even when doing so required extra plumbing. Every unit had cross or corner ventilation, and the low site density, that panacea of modernist design, dramatically increased the per unit cost of land. Implicitly, NYCHA valued these priorities above closet doors and shower heads, choices that were ultimately arbitrary judgments between essentials and extravagances, entirely removed from the input of prospective residents. And so if we were to think about the minimum dwelling once more, then we need to understand that setting minima involves making choices, relegating certain things to the realm of luxury and elevating others to the status of necessity. Whose priorities do we privilege where? And what are the politics involved when we begin to legislate priorities on behalf of others? So perhaps the minimum dwelling is more trouble than it's worth. Why, after all, raise the specter of a history ultimately far removed from the conversation about small housing today? In the time I have left, I want to argue that there are three ways in which the history of the minimum dwelling sheds important light on the issue of small housing in New York and other dense urban centers today. First, what we've seen is that the question of minimum need or minimum standards is not just a matter of scientific or expert opinion. These questions implicate what the political philosopher Giorgio Agamben has called the politics of bare life. That is, the politics that takes place in the complex struggles and negotiations over what it is to be human in the first place. We need to be cautious about understanding the political nature of revisions of seemingly banal housing regulations. And to grab one more snippet from the history, when someone like John Taylor Boyd said, "It now remains for the manufacturer, the laboring men, and the general public to determine labor's standard of living," this determination of the standard of living is, as we all know, the vital need of the whole world. Maybe we should take that seriously. That's a topic for intense political debate and contestation. Second, I think that we can take the minimum dwelling as a lens through which to read contemporary projects for small housing. Although these projects have not been conceived as sociological minima in the same way, they have required difficult choices among competing priorities and a particularly detailed imagination of the way they will be occupied. I don't want to pick on Carmel Place, but it is the sort of the prototypical minimum or micro housing project in New York. When we see this rendering, what does it mean that we're looking at a dinner party? What are the priorities that have been privileged? Who are the people that it's being imagined for? These are not necessarily reasons to condemn such a project, but they're things that we need to be conscious of and careful about as we think about the ways in which these projects may be solutions. In another sense, the utopianism of the minimum dwelling marks a sharp contrast to the ultimate timidity of much work on small dwellings today. Rather than seeking a minimum, the micro-apartment has pursued a miniaturization of prevailing norms in order to pack all the standard equipment into a smaller box. As a mode of political rhetoric, as we've seen, the minimum dwelling served to reveal the insoluble disjuncture between stagnant income levels and acute housing needs, while the micro-apartment has advertised itself as a solution in which everyone can win. The single person seeking privacy and affordability in a seller's market is invited to select small as a lifestyle choice rather than an inconvenience, while developers are able to squeeze more units out of precious square feet. For the single urban professional willing to trade anything for privacy, the micro-apartment is a reasonably intelligent solution, but when posed as a solution to the housing crisis, its broader politics are to suppress the real conflict of interest between tenants and developers. This brings me to my third and final point. I think that the minimum dwelling, with all its problems and paradoxes, will need to be constructively rethought if we are going to find a way to propose anything like a right to housing as part of a more general right to the city. For the minimum dwelling has always been oppressive and radical, ideological and utopian, all at the same time. At its best, the minimum dwelling was the nucleus of a concrete demand, one that was able to animate housing activists in the crucial years of the mid-1930s. What would a minimally acceptable or minimally desirable urban dwelling look like today? If we could guarantee a right to housing, what would that housing look like architecturally? And how would we go about formulating its design or its standards when we know all too well that humans are not homogeneous, that priorities are not universal, and that architecture all too often imposes the social norms of dominant portions of society? Rethinking the minimum dwelling in these terms seems like a deeply important task for experimental architecture today. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jessica Yager. I want to also thank Rosalie and Emily for inviting me to be here tonight. I'm really excited to be here to talk about some work that I did when I was at the NYU Furman Center that was looking at this question of whether or not small housing units can be used to meet the needs for affordable housing in the city. As Rosalie also mentioned, now I don't work at the Furman Center. I work at an organization called WIN, Women in Need, which is the largest provider shelter and supportive housing for families in New York City. But I'm using a Furman Center PowerPoint because I'm talking about work that I did while I was there, and this is the presentation that I have for it. So that explains that. We set out in this project to try to figure out the answer to whether or not it's actually cheaper to build smaller units, and therefore is there a potential for the rent for those units to be less. And then we also wanted to understand why more small units weren't built. So we wanted to understand the regulatory impediments that exist in the city to try to see if there are ways that make sense to loosen those potentially, and what the pros and cons of that might be. So in 2018, we released a white paper on this topic after doing research for about a year and a half, which I'm going to present. And we also released a policy brief, which we have copies of here tonight. And then we also had an event where there was a panel of experts talking about sort of the pros and cons of the approaches that we suggest in the paper, and that was videotaped, and all of those materials can also be found on the Furman Center's website. So I just want to let you know that they live there in case you're interested in getting more information. So tonight I'm going to present our research, and I'm going to start with a summary of our motivation for thinking about this question by presenting some of the data that we looked at that we think suggests that if there were more small housing units available for cheaper rents, there might be a demand for them in the city. So, of course, many people in New York City live alone and they struggle to pay rent. Well over 400,000 adults in the city live alone and pay over 30% of their income on housing costs. And over 250,000 of these New Yorkers pay over 50% of their income in housing. The vast majority of rent-burdened single-person households in the city are low income. About 85% of them have income below 80% of the area median income, or AMI, which is considered low income by HUD standards. Also, over 400,000 people in New York City live with roommates. And over 300,000 of those New Yorkers have low or moderate incomes. Of course, some people choose to live with roommates because they want to, but there's good reason to believe that in this number that there are a fair number of people who might choose to live alone if there were an affordable housing option available to them. Also, of course, many New Yorkers live in homeless shelters and in illegal housing. There are over 20,000 adults without children living in the shelter system. And there are estimated to be well over 100,000 New Yorkers living in a range of illegal housing types, like three-quarters houses, illegal basements, and illegal SROs. So this is just a quick overview of some of the data we looked at, but in light of these statistics, we concluded that if there were that there would be demand for smaller units in the city if they existed and if they were in fact cheaper. So then we wanted to understand why is it that, well, first of all, we wanted to try, the next step of the project was to try to figure out, so is it in fact possible to build smaller units for cheaper? And then if so, why aren't they built? So first, do smaller units allow for cheaper rents? To explore this question, we compared the cost of building and operating a small studio apartment with the cost required for 3 small unit types, which are all shown here. A 300 square foot self-contained micro unit, a 225 square foot efficiency unit with a shared kitchen and a private bath, and a 160 square foot efficiency unit where there's both a shared bath and a shared kitchen. For our financial modeling, we made a number of assumptions. We talked to experts, developers and people in the city and city government, we have a long appendix in the paper that explains our assumptions, but here's some of the information that we based the analysis on. In our analysis, we compare the per unit price of each unit type based on the cost of building a full mid-rise building of that type. We assume a full property tax exemption in all of our buildings. And the chart on the slide shows you our assumptions about market types and the minimum return a developer would need to earn in each case, in each type of market. And I should note, when we were doing this research, it was a couple of years ago, so these numbers might be slightly stale. So this is what we found. First, as units get smaller, you can fit more of them into a given space. But smaller units are harder to lay out efficiently. The loss factor increases as the unit size falls. And small units with shared facilities also require more of the building to be set aside for common space. So in our hypothetical mid-rise building, a developer could fit 126 traditional 400 square foot studio units. She could fit 37 more units in the same space if those units were micro units, 73 more units into the space if they were efficiencies with shared kitchens, and 125 more units into the space if they were efficiencies with shared baths and kitchens. You can see this if you compare the numbers on the second row of this figure. Here we show the rents and corresponding incomes, shown in AMIs, necessary to support construction, maintenance, and operation for each of our unit types, assuming 4 different levels of land costs. We found that as units get smaller, they become cheaper to build, so they require less rent to justify development. Assuming a full property tax exemption and no land costs, which is the first example on the slide, but no other subsidy, we estimate that a small studio requires a rent of about $1,480 a month to support construction. This is affordable to a household earning 89% of AMI, or about $60,000 a year. The rent amount and corresponding AMI drops as the unit size drops and as the facilities are shared. At the low end of our spectrum, an efficiency unit with a shared kitchen and bath requires a rent of about $840 a month to support construction, which is affordable to a household earning 51% of AMI, which is about $34,000 a year. This increase in affordability corresponding with smaller units is due in part to the lower development costs per unit for small units. The costs per building are higher for micro units and for efficiency units with shared kitchens compared to the standard studio because of the additional piping and fixtures that are needed. But the cost per unit of construction is lower for all of the small unit types because the cost of construction is divided among more units. Both building level and unit level costs are cheaper for efficiency units with shared bathrooms and kitchens than they are for small studios. The greater affordability of small units can also be attributed to the fact that we estimate that operating costs per unit would also be lower for small units, which is shown on the bottom 2 lines of this slide, even though the total operating cost increases for the building. It's important to note that the costs of operations management are very hard to estimate, especially for units with shared spaces, which is something we grapple with in more detail in the paper. But again, our assumptions about this can be found in the appendix, and maybe this is something we'll end up talking about in our panel discussion today. So based on our research, it appears that indeed smaller units are cheaper to build and therefore could potentially be rented at lower levels than larger size units. So if they're cheaper to build, why aren't more of them built? We wanted to understand sort of what the regulatory framework was around the building of these types of units to understand why that might be. So there are a number of barriers that exist, is what we found. And there are a number of things that the city could do to lessen or eliminate those barriers, which we discuss in detail in the paper, and I'm going to talk about 3 of those barriers here tonight. So first, the largest barrier to construction of new micro units is the density factor in the zoning resolution, which limits the number of units that can be created on a zoning lot. This regulation applies to micro units, but notably it does not apply to units with shared facilities. So it doesn't apply to our, what we call efficiency units in the paper. the density factor makes it impossible to have micro units make up a large share of units on a lot and still use up most of the floor area ratio or most of the capacity that's allowed on that lot. But if the city were interested in permitting more micro units to be built, it could remove the density factor in places that are appropriate for this unit type. For example, in places that are higher density areas of the city that are near good transit. Eliminating or even reducing the density factor would permit more units to be built on a lot. And more units may prompt concerns in a neighborhood about overcrowding. But more micro units, it's important to remember, doesn't necessarily mean more people in a given space, given that that larger units are more likely to be occupied by multiple occupants. Another major barrier that exists to the creation of new small units is found in the Housing Maintenance Code. And it's the element that limits who can build new rooming units. So the efficiency units that we describe in the paper are rooming units under the law. And they can only be built according to the Housing Maintenance Code if they're created with substantial government assistance or if they're owned, occupied, or used by a nonprofit. So the law prohibits the creation of new efficiency units or rooming units created by for-profit entities, and it also might, in fact, also prohibit mixed income rooming units because substantial assistance isn't defined anywhere in the law. So if the city were interested in broadening the use of shared housing, like the efficiency units we described, it could seek to amend the law to allow for the creation of market rate or mixed income rooming units. And I think that, it's a complicated question whether or not that's a good idea, and we discussed some of the issues there in the paper, and perhaps again we will on the panel today, but I think one of the questions that we ask is, are there other types of protections that can be put in place short of this absolute ban that can make sure that those units are well maintained if they were to be created? Well maintained and well run, of course. So, for example, the law already requires that the housing commissioner approve any new rooming unit that's being made, and that requirement could be used or expanded to the creation of rooming units that are being made by for-profit entities. And finally, the third major barrier that I'm going to talk about tonight is related to financing. Private lenders are still wary of these housing types. Even though micro units have been built in New York City, it's still a relatively new model. And there really aren't many examples of the type of shared housing that we're talking about in the paper, such that there's been proof of the model when it comes to thinking about convincing lenders to lend. So for this, we have a couple of recommendations. First, in the paper, we recommended that the city test the model by creating 2 demonstration projects. And the benefit of that is that the city, if the city were to put money into testing this out, it could determine if there really is a demand for small units at different rent levels. It could determine if there's demand for the type of efficiency units or shared housing that we talk about. The city could use these demonstration projects to help develop best practices around maintenance and operations, which we do think are complicated issues in this type of housing. And it could also test out, really what does it cost to build? Are the assumptions that we make really accurate? Are the assumptions about the savings that could be realized here? And one of the things I'm happy to report is since we put this paper out, HPD actually did something like this. So in November of 2018, HPD issued a request for expressions of interest for Share NYC, and is working with developers and architects, I think, to explore these ideas. So that's an exciting development. And the other thing that we hope will ultimately come out of the work that HPD is now undertaking in this area is that ultimately, if the demonstration project suggests that this is a model that can work, I think, what we argue is that there could be an opportunity for HBD to create a program dedicated to this housing type that could provide subsidy to support the construction of buildings that include micro units and efficiency units with shared facilities, and that could be designed to work with the existing tax exemption programs and the inclusionary housing program to sort of facilitate the development of these units in the city. It would also allow, again, HPD to test out and evaluate building management and operations and develop best practices, and also an oversight mechanism around those issues. And it could also allow HPD to create a new set of design guidelines and requirements specific to these unit types to make sure that they're being designed in a way that makes them most conducive for high quality living and operations. So that is the overview of our work. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our conversation.
Good evening. So my perspective on the issue of microhousing comes from a different place than the other presenters. I think in some ways the history of efforts to construct affordable housing and small units are very much captured by Jonah's presentation, and I would say the current existing literature is very much captured by Jessica's. So when I did a brief update review on the topic, I found that all of the publications had already kind of concluded they were a good idea on the same kinds of basis of people and cost and so on, and their aim was to figure out how to make it attractive to developers, lenders, and what policymakers could do about it. My perspective is to look at how people experience housing and how it affects communities, and at a broader scale, how it affects the fabric of the city. And I'm going to show you a lot of pictures. So my early work was on human crowding, which I did because I came to New York City from having never lived any place like this before. And I did a lot of work on it over many years, and it's still, I have still continued to do a little. But this is like a summary, a very gross level of what the findings are. So human crowding affects household interactions and can lead to social withdrawal. For children, it especially creates difficulties in managing emotions and can create worse school performance probably because of that combination with lack of privacy. Activity constraints due to small spaces are obvious, but in a lived everyday experience, it can be more than a small problem. Conflict in households over activity compatibility are one of the things that lead to social withdrawal inside and outside of the dwelling. It's a way of avoiding the conflict. Also, people who already have other stresses are more likely to experience stress related to crowding. This is an example of a micro apartment. Okay, so I think this sort of looks like what Jessica has in mind. And from the environmental psych research component, it has a number of good qualities and a number of problematic qualities. One is that there is no real privacy here. There are two beds in each space. And there's also no ability to kind of signal whether you're available or not available. The good quality is it has a bit of space for social interaction, and it's a really small, manageable number of people compared to like what could be thought of as an SRO. I'm showing you pictures that I did. It was really fun to like scour the internet for these things, and this is really selected, but they're all pretty similar. This is the image that we get. You might note there are all young dudes in the last picture. This is a bunch of young, stair-climbing people who love like hanging out with each other, and there are no children in this picture. This is an example. I can't see how this would ever be cost-effective. It looks like a showroom to me, but it was a micro-apartment kind of write-up of the sort of elaborate shared spaces that are imagined along with this and are usually highlighted. This is another example of how cool it is to hang out between the ages of 20 and 30. Okay, well, there. But it's not all I found. There was a Brooklyn hostel that was, I thought, a very sensitive example of reuse of existing buildings, which is something that is very important. New building is not great for the environment, not always possible and often not cost effective. This was an old building that was reused as kind of shared space micro units. Oops. And I guess I should have put more examples because there. It seems like it has a lot of good qualities. If you're going to be sharing space, it does not share kitchens and it does not share bathrooms. Well, maybe it could be like 2 rooms and that. But it does have like a very homey, livable feel to it. And it's not huge as a building, which I think, and my research shows, makes a difference. This is a Hong Kong example of a micro unit. This is the living area. And this is an example of how it's related to work areas. And this is an example of the work areas. One of the subtitles on this was live in a bunk, work in a bank. And I was interviewed by someone from Hong Kong about the topic of crowding and microunits and so on, and I learned a great deal from that, about how it's affected not just the specific people, but the entire city of Hong Kong. This is a plan in China for a whole micro village where everything is kind of miniaturized and a great deal of, I just thought it was like amazing they were thinking at that scale. That's why I put it in. So here, just to review some of the issues around density, behavior, and mental health. Activity constraints, obviously, right? What can you do in how many square feet? So just think about it. A person with my wingspan probably couldn't do Pilates in most of those spaces. Coordination of activities, if you have more than one person, is a real issue. And it can, over time, erode relationships. Now, not very much research has been done on this, but I've talked to lots of journalists, and this is, in fact, one of the things they found is you start out as one person, you end up as 2 people, sometimes you end up as 3 people, and that becomes increasingly difficult. The programming needed for amenity spaces to function as social has to be there, and this is more likely to not, it's more necessary for less advantaged populations and for those with other risk factors and less likely to be there. It does constrain couple and family formation, and like that's a 20 to 30 thing, even though lots of people live in that section of the life, and then there are a lot of elderly people. This is a life cycle, not just a final moment in time. And moving has its cost. Then there's relationship of the unit in the building to amenity spaces, which is crucial and also problematic. It can be provided by things outside the unit. Able-bodiedness seems to be assumed in most of these examples. Now, I found this example of a family of 4 sharing an apartment. There's a boy putting his desk away and getting his bed out. And this is, you might note there are never all 4 people in this family in the picture at the same time. This is the adults having a guest over. Now, I don't think that's outside the realm of possibility, but I also don't think it's a public policy issue, because I think if there's a market there, that the market will provide the profit. But, so the good things would be possible adaptive reuse of existing buildings. When collective amenities are included, it can alleviate claustrophobia and isolation. You need a flow of private, semi-private, and public spaces in life and physically. Amenities can be attractive enough to overcome shortcomings. And even for small families, the option of moving out of the city versus living somewhat constrained while you send your children to private school or live in the school district you want to, I can see that being attractive. Interior design and building layout are crucial, and space for architectural inventiveness, and I would invite that, although I do think the private sector can probably accommodate that. Questions for mini living. so far marketed to young, well-employed, and childless families. It can crowd families out of a metropolitan area. That was the source of the Bloomberg News interview from Hong Kong, which is, well, now nobody's building family housing anymore. No one can live here because this is actually very profitable and we've gotten it down to a minimum. How does it integrate with the prevalence of working at home and telecommuting as a form of work these days? Is the community infrastructure adequate? And what are the joint effects of small units in high-density neighborhoods? It's a little bit of research on children living in crowded housing and crowded schools, and it makes the effect more problematic. Economic concerns. Does it really serve the portion of the 1 and 1+ households of cities? Elderly people with limited income, single moms, young people with low-paying jobs. That's not how it's really imagined in the private sector and in most of the things. In fact, the articles I found that were like doing the kind of math of it didn't really look at how it worked out in terms of who lived in them or whether it ever happened. A problem that concerns me is the great amount of housing being built in New York City that is really profitable because of investors, not because of users. And this would be a great thing. You can Airbnb it while you're, getting income from investors all over the world who are using it sort of like a mutual fund. Does it really cost less per square foot? Now, this is a difference between the in-principle calculations and the in-practice calculations, and I think we need to look at what actually happens versus what you can calculate could happen. With amenities is in higher density, and is expensive small space furniture, et cetera, required? So the version that the Furman Center put out is sort of like SROs. And I did a lit review on that, and so there's some obvious things. It's not adequate for children, and yet children happen. So if you're thinking about young people and you're thinking about young lower income people, you have to think about the fact that there can be children coming along, and there might not be other options for living, and what are you going to do then? If it's, so a problem, it's very much sort of like the theory of homeless shelters. And I work with Picture the Homeless and some other housing groups. And people don't like the way in which people who live in those things break up household units. So it's just for women, or it's just for women with children under 12 who are not boys, or it's just for men, or it's just for single people, or it's really inadequate for everybody. And so you want to avoid those things. Those are known things that you can find by looking at real housing. If the SRO is for transients, and that was unclear in the Furman study, they mentioned transients and also permanent housing. Frequent moves have child developmental, mental, and physical health risks associated with them, so it's different from permanent housing. And I'm not sure thinking of it as transient is good, although I can imagine very well run, very well maintained, very well managed housing that fills the need for transient homeless housing better than what we have now. Can more support be given to facilitate nonprofit ownership? Now, there was a critique in the last paper about the way in which nonprofit ownership is sort of assumed, but if you read any book or know any nonprofit housing developers, you know that it is very, 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 very hard to do. And it makes it hard for them to compete for land and funds, and they usually have to partner with for-profit developers in order to pull almost anything out. And not all of the reasons why it's so hard to develop nonprofit housing have any really good justification. Or if they do, then developers who are for-profit should also have them. There's a concern, I have a concern about conveying public property and tax abatements to already highly profitable developers. I'm not sure that's where we should be putting our subsidies. I think there are lots of ways that we can improve access to affordable housing if we short-circuit the profit component. I would advocate for the use of community land trust when this happens so that land is transferred to a community land trust with a permanent affordability mandate and some capacity, and then it's leased to the developer, and that could be a for-profit or a not-for-profit developer, but based on how the performance is and the extent to which it meets the goals, the lease can be renewed or not renewed. I think obviously there's a need for programming and community space. And then in reviewing the SRO literature, I really was looking for something that was like more positive. Because I think there's a huge loss to the city by having no SROs. It increases homelessness. But the track record for vulnerable populations wasn't very good. It included a tendency it was a risk factor for drug use, for addiction, for HIV transmission. And I think if you look at a recent experiment with this, which is like group homes for the mentally ill, it hasn't been a very successful experiment. So I hope this gives us some things to talk about. And I will look forward to the discussion, which I think is going to happen right now.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to thank Jonah, Jessica, and Dr. Saegert for those informative presentations. And I wanted to thank the Architectural League for this entire series. It's no small task to confront the enormity and complexity of this topic. And I don't speak for Bill and Miriam as well, but it's incredibly laudable that this series is taking place. So thank you, Rosalie and Emily and the League. So this is going to be a little bit of a freewheeling discussion between all of us. There's a lot that we just saw, and there's a lot to discuss. So no apologies for how meandering or all over the place this might be, because it's a complicated topic. I was going to start with, I'll start with a little, maybe too much information about my own living situation in my history. So I had all these things prepared, and it went out the window. I grew up in a house with 6 people in 2,000 square feet, and this is a little bit simplistic. And then, like you, Dr. Saegert, I moved to New York after grad school, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And my first 2 homes, I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment, which was about 500 square feet with my sister. That's a little too much information. And then from there, with 2 other friends, so 3 of us in 800 square feet. And then I had my own apartment, which was 900. Then there were 2 of us in there. Then there were 3 of us in there. Family growing. And then 4 of us in 1,000 square feet. And then finally, now we're in a house full circle where there are 4 of us with 2,000 square feet. And this raised some questions for me as I was sitting there, which were maybe a little bit less policy-based, a little less aesthetically based, but things like, could I have lived differently, right? What did I actually need when I was living in those places? What do I need now? What should anyone or everyone have the right to within a dwelling? And these are questions that we fundamentally face as architects, as we read through code and as we design buildings. So I wanted to throw out a question it's to everyone. I don't think everyone needs to answer it because we don't have a ton of time, and we'll take some audience questions at about 8:30 or so. But what are, to any of you, I guess personally or politically, what are the necessities for a minimum dwelling in a dense urban setting? What makes a minimum dwelling acceptable? So whoever wants to take that on first as an opening question. And then Bill and Miriam have questions as well, I believe, and we'll go from there.
I'm ready to turn this on.
I think
It's on.
Yeah.
I'm ready to jump in, although I enjoyed and learned a lot from all the speakers, and thank you for your insights. And one of the slides we saw and I can't remember which speaker, but it made an impression on me, was this balance of private, semi-private, and public spaces. I think however those are configured and whatever minimum actually means, and from whatever perspective, those balances of different experiences for each person are critical. And I think in many of the projects we've worked on, both independently and together with you, we've tried to create that balance of the totally private, the semi-private, and the public type space to allow for a variety of human experience.
I guess I can say, I think, you know, I've lived in fairly small apartments fairly comfortably. You know, I think the question of what is a reasonable minimum is all about the occupant. And I think that the problem with the current situation is that it's often not up to the occupant what their minimum is, it's up to the occupant's income. But you know, right, if someone can live happily in a small place, let's let them live in a small place. But if someone can't afford to live in a place that is their minimum, that's where the problem is.
I don't know whether my thing is on or not, but I would say that you hit upon an issue which I had planned to talk about, but I didn't, which is that two things have always turned out to be hugely important in psychological studies of almost everything related to stress and poor outcomes, and they have to do with choice and control. And I think instead of looking at a unit, a housing unit, as being like the determinant, that the process by which the unit comes into being and the way in which the groups who will reside there and the people who will provide the housing relate to each other, and in multifamily units, especially the way in which the people who live in the same building or in the same SRO come together. In Canada for a while there was a program on cooperative housing that would form organizations who wanted to have very affordable housing. The government provided subsidy for 5 years to work with planners and facilitators on a process of developing the kind of housing appropriate for the group, and the group forming its ways of governing itself and relating to the space. And that's really different than when you're just renting things up. And while in general informal housing has a bad rep and it leads to lots of problems, it often allows for more choice and control around how groups are formed who share housing and how they govern the sharing of the housing. And I think those are things outside of the architectural domain.
I would say that I think that all of the issues that the other two speakers brought up are really important as we think about designing housing, but that at the end of the day, I think government's job is to make sure that housing is safe. And I think it's very important that policymakers and people who build housing and everybody, the community, comes together to think about issues about design and involvement and equity, and all of those things are critically important. Government policy obviously should also think about equity, but I think that in terms of the minimum standard for what we require in housing, I think it relates to safety, and I am not an expert to say what those safety requirements are, and I think obviously there are safety elements in terms of and health elements related to both physical and mental health related to the size of the unit, which I think is what Susan was speaking about, and I think those are important to keep in mind. But I think that beyond that, regulation should not, I mean, people should be able to live how they want to live, and that regulation shouldn't go beyond that in this area. I think part of the problem is that the building of housing got so regulated because of concerns about safety that were very real, and that was 100 years ago. And as technology has changed and the way that we build buildings has changed, there's opportunity to lessen those restrictions and still be providing safe, healthy housing for people, potentially at a cheaper rate, but also just potentially more housing and providing people more options. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about in preparation for today, and I think all three speakers really touched on, is the problem between something that is quantitative a minimum amount of space that someone can kind of move in, sleep in, dwell in. But housing is really about both quantitative and qualitative aspects. And what I appreciated so much about Jonah's paper, and then reinforced by a lot of what Susan said, is as soon as you kind of enter into the questions of qualitative, you get into territory of kind of cultural norms and individual preferences, and it becomes maybe almost insurmountably complicated. You know, I think it's been shown through the micro-unit example that certainly if you're making a choice to live in a particular way, you can successfully share a lot of things. But when you start to talk about affordability and, you know, if your only choice is to be in a place where you're sharing, you don't have that kind of maybe similar definition of a cultural norm that kind of binds your society together along the lines of what you were saying. Informal housing, or SROs, include, in theory, people who maybe don't have a choice to live elsewhere, but there's an understanding and they've gravitated towards a particular living condition because of common goals or support for each other that's really different from having no other option or getting to those circumstances through a lottery.
Jessica, I want to go back to this question of regulation for a second, because as an architect, sitting in front of the computer almost day by day, looking at zoning code, looking at regulation, right? The idea that the design process doesn't begin with some sort of sketch. Sorry to break the romance. It begins with section 23-662 of the New York City zoning code. So this question about regulation, I think, is an interesting one, because so much of what we do, how we practice, is based in regulation. So I'm not even sure this is a question, but how do we adjust, how do we memorialize regulations when regulations may either overly limit or protect? So how do we get to a balance? Maybe even a balance isn't the right word, but how do we know whether the regulation is effective or impeding or otherwise?
Yeah, I don't have the answer to that question. But I do. I mean, one of the things that I learned in writing this paper is that there's, you know, a crazy amount of regulations that are overlapping and in some cases contradictory that govern what can be built in New York City. And it seems like there is definitely room for taking a hard look at all of those and trying to bring them into alignment and thinking about, you know, today, given where we're at, you know, these things were written, like I said, like 100 years ago, what do we still need and what don't we need? And I think that is about then talking to experts, right? Like talking to architects and engineers and fire experts and all the folks who, but it does seem like it's possible. I can't do it, but I can imagine someone could bring those people together and do that.
Theoretically possible. Yeah, I think the issue of regulation is really, and housing is really a complex one, because as people have said, many of these regulations were in reaction either to disasters that happen, you know, catastrophic fires with loss of life, or unsafe and unhealthy living conditions. And then as times changed and priorities changed, and I think in talking before the event, and I know at least one representative from HPD is here, I'll mention, early in my career, we'd go to HPD, and the push was really to create larger units. And, you know, with the idea being larger units were more livable for families. More recently, the trend has been to look at smaller units, and I'm not talking about micro units, you know, smaller 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, and 3-bedroom apartments, and that comes out of several factors. One is a kind of a broader view of the housing market and what's being built in the market rate, as well as the affordable sector. The need to create more affordable housing, given limited resources, limited land, limited capacity to build, and a whole variety of factors, including the way people live. And I'm not making a judgment one way or the other. I'm just observing that regulation and standards change in response to a whole variety of social, economic, and political factors.
I'd like to make a point about the difference between regulation and subsidy. Definitely, New York seems overregulated. And everybody, all nonprofit, for-profit developers, have really their hands full to do anything whatsoever. And that does deserve a serious look and some kind of work like Jessica was suggesting to try to think about it. And I'm sure that's going on in city planning and HPD. The other question is whether or not this deserves efforts to make smaller units more accessible and shared units more accessible should also involve the transfer of public assets to private developers. And I feel like that's a separate question.
Well, I'd like to make one comment, maybe not exactly in response to what you just said, but related. A lot of the focus on micro units and smaller housing units is on projects like Carmel Place, which a couple of the speakers mentioned, or another project that Andy and our firm collaborated on, Caesura. A couple of slides from that are on the screen, and both exemplary and great projects, but there's a tremendous model for compact living in HPD's supportive housing program, which has detailed standards, qualitative as well as quantitative standards, generally developed by not-for-profit developers, targeted primarily to people with special needs, people coming out of homelessness or mental illness or addiction and so on, but with a significant portion reserved as affordable housing for community residents. And I think, a study of these projects, many of which are very successful and well maintained, well operated by the not-for-profit sponsors, create a good example for at least one type of housing. It's certainly not the answer to all our housing needs, but it provides a model for what I would call intelligent and humane development of compact housing.
Well, I was just going to actually elaborate on something that Bill said. You started to touch on this. That the administration, at the beginning of this current administration, the goal was to increase units, and therefore there's been pressure for units to become smaller and smaller, to meet need in terms of numbers. One of the things that I think is a challenge for us architects, and hopefully policymakers would support that, is we don't design a building for the length of an administration, but for hundreds of years, hopefully. And so I think one of the challenges from a design perspective is how to design buildings that are flexible and not so, precisely specific, that they can't be repurposed or reconfigured to be used by different kinds of family structures as time changes and goes on.
That's a great observation, I think.
I have a question for the architects and other housing providers in the audience and on the panel. Are there more examples of reuse of buildings to move toward these kind of shared spaces and micro units? I know I'm familiar with some just, by accident in research, but whether or not there's concerted effort in looking at that as well as looking at new development.
Are there
Yeah.
examples of constructed, executed projects?
Yeah, whether your firms engage in that kind of work, or whether, I just wonder how, it seems not so hard to me. I live in now, after many years, a brownstone, and it's been very flexible for having renters, for having, a child and then having her leave and having different household configurations. And that seems like what you said, it's a very core thing for thinking about building buildings, is how good they can be as things change.
There's, I don't have any experience with that. Bill, I think you've done one adaptation, the public school adaptation.
Yeah, this is not exactly the type of example you're mentioning, but we designed a project that was a public school on West 145th Street in Harlem, PS 186, that had really fallen into terrible disrepair. And in fact, the initial concept for the site was to tear the building down and build a new building. But there was a real community push to save this building that, as in bad as shape as it was treasured by the community. And with a creative developer, we renovated the building for affordable housing and a home for the Boys and Girls Club of Harlem. And I think that's the kind of creative reuse of existing building stock that is sustainable and is kind of already knit into the fabric of the community. I might add, there's a very, we focus a lot on new buildings, but there is a very robust program in the city, through HPD again, of preservation of existing housing and upgrading of the existing housing stock. And of course, NYCHA, which is very much in the news now, faces many of the same challenges of upgrading and improving, a tremendous resource in terms of available housing.
Yeah, that's a very good reference. In fact, and I know that Miriam has done some research on this as well, adaptation, not, again, without veering off the highway into a ditch. But the idea of adaptation is a really interesting one. Your work on expanding and adapting NYCHA work, and my own teaching, in which we looked at NYCHA houses, specifically in Chelsea, and found that when we got the existing plans from NYCHA, there were 4 and 5 bedroom apartments in these buildings. So the question about how you could repurpose some buildings without displacement and densify, which in a way is kind of strange because it returns us back to what Jonah has researched, this idea that the Red Hook houses, that those were the minimum dwellings. In fact, that many of NYCHA's developments contain highly maximal dwellings.
Another example of reuse in this context is, there are market rate examples in Brooklyn, like Common, right? that's, and so like of, tenement buildings being taken over and made into, shared housing for, young people. So sort of the types of pictures that you showed, but not in new buildings, and that there are, a lot of sort of high profile examples of that have been in the press.
That are, operating basically as illegal SROs, right? They're
Essentially.
Yeah, in a questionable space.
Yes.
Well,
We addressed that issue, the legal issue in our paper, actually.
And less high profile, right? Most of the affordable or reasonably affordable market rate housing that the kinds of people who are the prospective tenants of micro apartments are living in are adapted new law tenement buildings in 3 and 4 bedroom units that probably provide about as much space per person as a micro unit, that are being reconfigured as they're renovated.
Right, people are living this way informally, right, by taking over larger apartments.
So just another point on that too. Looking at the literature, I saw there's no discussion in New York because of, I think, our building stock and the fact that we have so many renters of accessory units, but that seems like a pretty popular, and so far no bad experience particularly with it. That doesn't mean there never will be, but so far it seems like a very successful way. It can improve the income of the resident. It can, alleviate problems like caring for elderly, live-in, nursing facility people, et cetera. And I know I've worked with the Community Land Trust in Minneapolis where they were beginning to build micro units or allow them when they renovate the housing and so on, so that people could afford the cost of housing. So the person who moved in and had to take a mortgage out on the house could also then rent out a space that was designed, and it also then at some point could be used for family members. So it's a pretty old model, but it seems worth thinking about.
That's a great point, and in fact, the city right now has a pilot program in East New York for the legalization of basement apartments, which is another thing that's commonly done kind of under the radar or outside the realm of, regulation, but with the consultation with the Department of Buildings, the fire department, and so on, programs been worked out to test legalized basement apartments as accessory units, and that's one of a number of approaches to the idea of accessory units.
So I think I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll ask the audience if there are any questions. So I'm going to hypothesize a future with a kind of an inevitable march of production of small units. So your chart where a building has 251 apartments versus 126. So what is something like this? Again, we're fictionalizing here. What does this mean for our city? Formally, urbanistically, or systematically? So where if a city densifies, if a city permits or deregulates or offers the ability or subsidizes a production of these types of units, and because we need to hit a unit count, we need to match political messages and also human needs, what does that mean for the education system? What does that mean? These are all questions that are pretty standard for densification. What does that mean for a transit system or a mental health system? So are there any thoughts here from the presenters about what that might mean looking ahead? I know it's, again, a very broad, somewhat unanswerable question. But what does a proliferation mean to this city?
So I think densification is a quantitative thing, and what you're describing is both quantitative and also qualitative, right? It's not just more people, it's more people who want to live in microunits, and that's more people without children, or more people with very young children, or more people who are single. And I mean, I would suspect, that it looks similar to what's happening in parts of Brooklyn, where tenement houses are being renovated as we speak to basically be microunits, collected as bedrooms with shared living spaces, that there are fewer children in neighborhoods, that there are fewer mom and pop shops in neighborhoods, that we see the sorts of qualitative changes that we understand as gentrification happening in places where microunits are the predominant form of housing.
I mean, I would say, just picking up on something that you said in your presentation, is that it involves planning. Densification or higher densities may be appropriate in high transit-rich neighborhoods like downtown Brooklyn, or other transit-intense neighborhoods, whereas there are probably more other and different appropriate models for other neighborhoods. So I think it's not a single answer of blanket everything with micro units. Let 1,000 types of units blossom. And I'd just like to make one other observation regarding increased density in general, though. I think in addition to the kind of amenities we've talked about, I think the contact with nature and the natural world is extremely important, and whether it's in the building in the form of a landscaped yard or a roof terrace, or increased numbers of parks, or just even the maintenance of parks, it's extremely important for a livable city, even especially as it becomes more dense.
New York City needs more density. I mean, I believe that strongly. And I just want to emphasize what you said about the human cost here. So, I mean, I think that one thing that would happen if we have more density is that there wouldn't be 60,000 people living in homeless shelters, and there wouldn't be hundreds of thousands of people paying more than 50% of their income on rent. So I think it's very important to plan appropriately and to think about minimum standards to make sure that any spaces, whether they're small or large, are safe and clean and habitable. But I think that we need more housing of all shapes and sizes.
So I just want to say, I think it's important to be sure that those people living in homeless shelters get that housing. And I did find one study that looked at the effect of building microunits on gentrification. And in San Francisco, it had no effect because it was just gentrifying everywhere. And in the other city, and I'm forgetting what it was in New Mexico or Arizona, it did increase gentrification in terms compared to other comparable places in the city. So the question really is, how's it working? Not what it could do in theory. Because a lot of housing has been built in New York. In my neighborhood in Brooklyn, I live near the Gowanus, tons of new housing. I don't think it's alleviating homeless shelters, as far as I can tell.
But it is helping to meet the demand for housing in the city, right? And if we don't build more housing, even at the higher income levels, higher income people are going to beat out people lower on the rung for that housing. And I mean, this is obviously a complicated and controversial point that we probably don't have time to.
And I just want to say that's why I think it should be tied to alternative competitions for asset investment. The regulatory question is separate, but I know there was a meeting at Gowanus where the city planning plans were revealed, and it turned into a near riot, and there was an alternative meeting led by public housing residents and people who are concerned about the natural environment and so on. And the concerns are not comparable. The concerns are about where you're putting your money, and also, I mean, there are some comparable things, like people were concerned about this capacity of the subway system and the school system and even the sewer system, which has never been fabulous in the neighborhood, and how that's going to go. So I think really that's where you have to get down to the concrete example in the place and what you're going to spend your money on. And that is a public policy matter, as well as a public policy process.
Are there questions from the audience? There are microphones. If you want to pose a question, please come down.
Or you could make a comment.
Or a comment, right? Or a comment. Doesn't have to be a question.
I'm a freelancer. I work from my house. I spend most of my day at home. I live in a 450 square foot apartment, which is palatial in comparison to a micro unit. But I don't think about safety, and I would be completely insane if I lived in a smaller place than what I have, where all my work materials are around me. So I'm just wondering who you envision lives in these places. This can only be people who spend their entire day outside. At the same time, there are less and less steady jobs. People work from their house, or they sometimes have these WeWork spaces, but I mean, I couldn't do this. I have to concentrate, and I'm on the phone and whatever. So I don't know who's the person who wants to live in a box and can be there 24 hours. That's my question.
So I imagine that's for me. So one of the points I want to make is I'm not saying we should all live in micro units or in SROs. That is not, I mean, I absolutely appreciate what you're saying. If I lived at home, I mean, if I worked at home, I would also not want to live in a 300 square foot or 200 square foot unit. The thing is, right now, they're not allowed at all, right? Or micro units are allowed in some circumstances, but they're certainly discouraged, and shared housing is largely not allowed. And the point that we're making in the paper is that some people might want to live that way given the other options they have now, which is that they are all the stats I went through in the beginning, right? People are living doubled up, they pay way too much money for rent, they're in homeless shelters. I mean, also SROs, of course it's true that there are lots of, there were certainly horror stories about SROs in the history of SROs, but SROs were around for 70 years and were a solid source of housing for a lot of people during that time. And for people of all different, I don't know that rich people were living there, but for a wide range of income levels, for new entrants to the city, for immigrants, for lower income people, for people, coming, people who were getting a divorce and needed somewhere to be for 6 months. I mean, I think that it's really the point that we're trying to make in the paper is that we just need more flexibility, right? And it's not that everyone needs to live in a micro unit for their whole life. I mean, that's not at all the point that we're making. We're just saying that the regulation, we should take another look at the regulations and see if is all this restriction really still needed? Which again, I'm not a code expert and I can't answer that, but I think, I've reason to believe based on the work that we did that there's room for more flexibility. And it could be that it can help meet the need. I mean, there's 8 million people in the city, and there's a lot of diversity in terms of what we need. And I think that the codes could be relaxed a bit to help allow us to meet that need better.
Hi, I have a question. I'm an architect. I don't know a lot about housing, but I have been in New York City for about 5 years now, which means I've changed a lot of apartments, and I've like looked at every single housing, search avenue that you can possibly look at, like gypsy housing, Craigslist, whatever you want, whatever you can say. I've had roommates before. I've had people who convert one bedroom into a flex, and then it turns into like a 3-bedroom apartment, and you're talking about code and requirements of dwelling and what a minimum dwelling actually is. And I'm wondering if there's, within the SROs and within the architecture firms and architects, is there any push for making all these regulations and codes known to people? Because a lot of habitations that I saw definitely didn't seem livable, but people did obviously know about that. There wasn't a lot of knowledge of what is actually the most minimum micro-dwelling that you were talking about.
Well, the New York City Code is publicly available, so it's not necessarily a question of availability, and multiple dwelling law is also publicly available. I think what you're asking probably is a question of enforcement, which is that there are probably hundreds of thousands of apartments and homes around the city that are actually illegally occupied. How the city could or whether they should enforce all those laws is another.
And the city does have a robust enforcement arm in the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, or HPD. But their resources are limited too.
But are you asking from almost like a consumer protection standpoint?
Yeah, more so, and people don't even know what consumer protection is when you're going to go look out for housing. This presentation to me personally was eye-opening. Like, I had no idea that there are all these like codes and regulations that need to be in place before you go out and look for places.
Well, it is highly, you're right, and how to communicate that to the general public, let alone to an architect. I mean, the codes that Andy's talking about and others have spoken about are very complex, very technical, and at times confusing even to professionals who deal with them on a daily basis. So I think it's a worthwhile goal, but it's definitely a challenge of how to kind of simplify this extraordinarily complex information and communicate it.
Thank you.
I think it's also potentially, something that architects could think about. Right? How do you design a dwelling that admits the possible misuses of it in its future life? In the early 20th century, when tenement reformers were formulating the Tenement House Law of 1901, one of the big concerns was, what were you going to do about the lodger problem? Which is to say, all the immigrant families in the Lower East Side took in a lodger because that was the only way they could pay the rent. And you had to walk through the lodger's room to get to the bathroom in the middle of the night. And reformers were very worried about that. And their solution was an architectural one. They forced people to put long hallways into the apartments. And the effect was that you had apartments where it was really easy to let a room to a lodger. And those apartments are still around and they're still being used. And in a lot of cases, they lend themselves to groups of people cohabiting with one another. And so I would wonder, what are the ways that if we're designing micro units or other forms of flexible housing now, how do we think it might get misused? What are the 1,000 scenarios that we can imagine? And can we design in that flexibility and then some more flexibility for the scenarios that we can't imagine?
I think there's also been an unresolved debate among affordable housing advocates about whether or not to enforce codes because of the concern that so much affordable housing in the city would actually disappear then. And I don't have an answer to that, but I know it exists, that if every unit were brought up to code, no matter kind of what the code, a lot of people wouldn't have places to live. I don't have an answer.
It's a tough one because I'm sure you're right, but then you have the example of the horrible tragedies of fires and loss of life, and it's a tough one to where to draw the line and what's the right balance.
But also, that there are so many apartments in the city that have grandfathered in non-compliant conditions, and there's a reason it would be overly burdensome to require every landlord to bring their buildings up to current code standards. So you know, I mean, I lived in a tenement building with one of those long corridors in a bedroom that had an interior window to the kitchen that went to my bathroom that didn't even have a sink in it. And it was a pretty nice apartment, 5 floors walking up. You know, there's nothing inherently bad, let's say, about the configuration of a tenement building, but when it is misused, it changes the nature of it.
And I think that's one of the big challenges of housing, and always has been in New York and other big cities, is the bad actors. I mean, at least we're very fortunate in that all our clients are really up and up developers and housing operators, and you want to do the right thing. Sometimes they're frustrated in doing it by the complexity of the situation, but there's certainly plenty of bad actors out there, just, you know, are out there just to make the extra dollar, and, you know, don't care about the quality of the properties they own and operate. So it's a tough one to build in that, you know, kind of bulletproof buildings against what people may do to them or with them.
This might be an area in which some regulatory changes, well, first, some architectural invention could possibly be helpful. If instead of just like developing a plan, if maybe this is for architecture schools or something, but could you develop buildings where you could go from micro units to family housing, to accessory apartments, to things like that, and that would be somehow valued. I mean, again, I'm wary about subsidies for these things because of alternative possible uses for them. But I think that would be very well worth a lot of imagination. And even looking at all those, I know all my grad students, and I too, when I first moved here, lived in things that might not have been really legit. And I know people who've raised, like, you know, 2 children in a 1-bedroom or a studio apartment, and they didn't treat it that way exactly. But that might be very helpful, and then to think about what are the things that make those illegal and whether or not they're necessary, or some simpler process could be put in place legally to go from a 1-family to a 3-family to whatever, you know, or 3-unit kind of thing. Anyway, I would love to see more of that.
Thank you all for this wonderful conversation. It's very important, and getting into the meat of what we can do in imagination and inventiveness and regulation and all those sort of things that go into SROs. But I kind of want to add the question and the pivot, and maybe should we also be questioning the maximum dwelling, in a sense of where can we start to regulate in those areas? What should be legal for people to live in, and what do we start to do to adaptively reuse those places that are not being used right now? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I have a quick thought. I think vacancy decontrol is like taxes on vacant units is one. If 0 people are living in something, I think that's like a place where it's not so controversial as if actually people are living in it.
And I think that, I mean, I think that is starting to be done on vacant storefronts, because there are a lot of empty storefronts in this neighborhood in particular and throughout all of New York City. And I believe that they're considering vacancy taxes on empty storefronts because landlords are not leasing out the spaces for lower rents than they're typically accustomed to.
Well, it's interesting. I'm not sure, you know, society's prepared to regulate, you know, oversized units or ban $50 million apartments or whatever. But I think, to me, one of the ironies of the housing market on a national scale is here we're spending all the time, our time talking about smaller units, SROs, and so on, whereas nationally in suburban America, the tendency is still for units, for houses to be growing. And, you know, there's been a steady increase over the last probably 40 years or more, from the Levittown examples that you've been exploring, Jonah, to the the McMansions of the 90s and to the mega houses of today, of larger and larger housing units in the form of houses. So it seems like just an observation, an odd juxtaposition between the density of cities and the need for affordable housing and this kind of ever-expanding, non-sustainable approach to housing of units that probably are too big.
I don't know if it's just too big necessarily, Tom, but it might be something like an exponential property tax on assessed value, right? So if you buy a $58 million apartment, even if it's 1,000 square feet, then your transactional tax on that and your annual tax on that should be exponentially, not proportionally larger than the person who lives in a 600 square foot apartment. So that costs 1/5800th of that, or whatever it might be.
I also think there could be some role for market rate small units, right? I mean, if we can create, which is different than what we're talking about in our paper, which is about how to help people who need affordable housing. But I mean, if you had shared housing or micro units that were truly attractive communities where people wanted to be, that could help with downsizing. It could help get millennials to move from shares in Brooklyn that really should be housing families into, Manhattan, where they can have or people who, are in brownstones but are a single person and now could live in, shared housing.
I think we have time for one more question.
This is more of a comment than a question. Something I've observed is that the difference between a market rate micro unit is that the developer will spend the extra money for those jazzy amenity spaces and kind of getting your workplace lounge and your green terraces, whereas a project that would be kind of done as affordable housing, the fact is that you have double the bathrooms and double the kitchens, so your construction cost per square foot is rocketing, right? And the first target is the green roofs, and the first target is the common spaces. So is there a way for HPD to integrate some of those requirements as part of a micro-dwelling unit as well?
Well, I think that's a great observation, and as I mentioned earlier, the supportive housing program that HPD sponsors and often subsidizes primarily for not-for-profit developers does require a certain amount of social and public shared spaces as well as outdoor space. And I think at least most of the clients we've worked with, the not-for-profit developers, really care about that, because an important part of their mission is not only providing housing for people, but providing social opportunities and kind of an integrated lifestyle for people who have been underserved. And so, I'm sure there are examples where, those types of social spaces are shortchanged, but I think there are many successful stories where they are preserved, and it's a challenge because of the economic and other constraints.
A few years ago, there was a New Housing New York competition. I'm sure HPD was one of the sponsors. There were many sponsors. And I think it developed some very good examples, and it had to be in an affordability envelope. It had to be green, and it had to be innovative and beautiful. And I think the kinds of things that came out of that were all excellent. And I know I'm on the board for the Women's Housing Economic Development Corporation, and I think their housing has always strived for that and succeeded. It's really, really tough to do. And I think their regulatory angst is very often with HUD, mostly. But I think when the city can promote those kinds of things, so you can go online and look at the examples, and I think they're really interesting. And I think, like Wedco I was on their team, and they didn't win, but they still got a site and they still built their plan, and I don't know whether the others did too. But so there are examples out there, and well worth looking at.
And we were on the winning team, which is called Via Verde at Brook Avenue, 156th Street. The other finalists, of which Wedco was one, were great and really interesting too. And Via Verde's been completed for 7 years now. It looks great. It's well used, well maintained. The green roofs are there. The social spaces are there, and it's been a very successful model.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Rosalie may have one more thing to say.
I want to thank all of our presenters and panelists, and to put in another plug for you all, please, to come next week when we're going to be discussing shared housing and co-living. Again, there's a major overlap with some of the topics that we talked about tonight, but I think you'll find that the presentations next week will offer some new information and new perspectives on it. So thank you all very, very much.